Well, for more, we can speak now to Alan Dershowitz, who is a Harvard Law School Professor Emeritus and former attorney to President Trump. He joins us from New York. Always a pleasure seeing you, Professor Dershowitz. Just want to ask you, what went through your mind today as you watched those scenes playing out in Israel, on the streets and at the Knesset?
It was a great day for the Palestinian people, for the Israeli people, for the Middle East. It's only a bad day for those who would want to see Israel destroyed. A very bad day for Iran, a very bad day for the protesters in New York and throughout Europe, none of whom ever called for a two-state solution. They called for a replacement of Israel by Palestine. So those who want to see the end of Israel, it's a terrible day. But those who want to see a two-state solution ultimately and peace in the Middle East, it's a very, very good beginning.
I think quite a lot of people want to see a two-state solution, don't they? There was even one heckler at the Knesset, a man by the name of Ayman Odeh, who called for the recognition of a Palestinian state. I mean, would you support that? Do you see that happening eventually?
Of course, I think it's the only ultimate solution. It was offered to the Palestinians in 1938, 1947, 1948, 1967, 2000, 2001, 2005, 2007. The Palestinians have always turned it down. The Israelis have always accepted it. It's not going to happen immediately because Hamas still retains some authority in Gaza, but ultimately it's the right solution. But it will take building and time to do it. But ultimately, two states for two people living in peace would produce great results for the Middle East and for the world. Palestinian people are wonderfully innovative and scientific. And if they work together with Israelis, not under the leadership of Hamas, but under the leadership of leaders who really want to see a peaceful resolution, there's no limits on what could be done in the interests of peace.
To whom would you give the greatest credit, Professor Dershowitz, for this conclusion to what's been 24 bloody months?
Well, there's a short-term answer to that. The short-term answer is the Israeli military. By overcoming October 7th and defeating Hamas militarily, defeating Hezbollah, destroying parts of Iran's nuclear capacity. It made Donald Trump's diplomacy feasible. Without the combination of Israel's military successes and Trump's diplomatic successes, I don't think we would have seen this achievement. But I also have to give a lot of credit to the Arab countries in the region who came along with Donald Trump and put pressure on Hamas, even including some non-Arab countries like Turkey. So you have to give credit where credit is due. You know, success has many parents, failure is an orphan, and this was a success. So the credit should be spread around to many people and institutions and nations.
I was expecting you to mention one name, and you didn't mention him this time, but it's reported that you put forward Jared Kushner's name for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 for his role in Arab-Israeli normalization efforts. I mean, how instrumental has he been in these latest efforts?
Very instrumental, and I plan to put forward, I'm one of the Nobel nominators for the Peace Prize. I plan to put forward not only Jared Kushner, but also Steve Witkoff, along with President Trump for next year's Nobel Peace Prize. And remember that the Nobel Committee does, according to the will of Alfred Nobel, require that the winner of the Peace Prize be somebody who brought peace between countries, not within a country. And so it seems to me that these are obvious candidates for that kind of a prize. But Jared Kushner, my former Harvard student and friend for many years, deserves an enormous amount of credit. He came out of basically retirement from government and came back and really helped do this the way he helped do the Abraham Accords. And I played a very tiny role early on in the Abraham Accords and some of the other peace initiatives during Trump's first administration. So I saw Jared firsthand working, and he did an amazing job. He's an amazing young man.
I'm going to come back to him in just a moment. I just want to ask you, though, for your reaction to the news that President Trump didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize this time around. Do you stand by the Nobel Committee and their decision perhaps to hold off till next year when there's, more fruit, so to speak, on the table?
No, they should have given the prize to two people at this point. They should have given it to the woman who got the prize. She deserved it, even though she doesn't come within the will of Alfred Nobel because she didn't bring about peace between countries. but they can give the prize to 3 people, and they should have given the prize this year to Donald Trump and to the woman who got it. And next year, perhaps they can give it to those who helped bring about Trump's diplomatic successes, people like Steve Witkoff, and maybe even one person from the other side, from the Arab side or the Palestinian side. There'd be no objection to that as well, because peace requires, obviously, some degree of compromise on all sides.
Okay, so next year's Nobel Peace Prize could go, you think, to a group of individuals, perhaps the ones who've brought us to the point we're at today.
Yeah.
Okay, Jared Kushner, just going back to him, obviously, as you were saying, very much the architect, or one of the architects of the Abraham Accords, and his next goal is to bring about what he's called a new Middle East. What does that look like, do you think, Professor Dershowitz?
Well, it looks like the Gulf states playing a major role because of their wealth and the way they've strategized their wealth. They have been absolutely brilliant in turning oil into artificial intelligence, science, and technology. And I think we see a new East focused on working together, building on the Abraham Accords, working together, Israel and the Gulf states. I think what we're seeing is a diminution of the impact of some of the other Arab states like Lebanon and Iraq and Syria. And we're seeing the center move south and move toward the Gulf states. And I think that's a great development because the Gulf states are not ideological. They're interested in stability. They're interested in increasing their influence, they're increasing their wealth. They're interested in positive developments, whereas, at least in the past, Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iraq and Syria have been more interested in destruction than construction. So I think that movement south has been a very positive movement.
We haven't mentioned Prime Minister Netanyahu yet, and I know you're a staunch defender of Benjamin Netanyahu, accusing some of his critics of having BDS, which you call Bibi derangement syndrome. Do tell me if I'm quoting you out of turn or misquoting you. But what do you see as being his future? Do you think his political future is tenable? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, Israel's a vibrant democracy, as evidenced by what happened at the Knesset today. Nobody can predict what the outcome of an Israeli election will look like. There have been, 4 or 5 elections over the past 6 or 7 years, and there's going to be another one coming up next year. And I think these recent developments will strengthen Netanyahu. But remember also that Bennett, who's going to be running against Netanyahu, contributed to this as well by making it possible for Netanyahu to make this kind of peace without fear of his government crumbling. So, Israel's a very complicated democracy with very vibrant media and critics. So nobody can predict Netanyahu's future, but I think we can predict Israel's future. And I think Donald Trump predicted it very well in his speech today, saying it is a strong country, will be there forever. Anybody who tries to destroy Israel will fail. And I would hope that these useful idiots that are demonstrating all over Europe and Norway and Italy and other places for the end of Israel will understand that they cannot bring about that result, that they ought to devote their energies to actually helping the Palestinian people instead of hurting Israel.
Now, it's been reported that you've offered to represent Prime Minister Netanyahu in the event that he appears before the International Criminal Court. And again, do tell me if I'm wrong.
No, that's correct.
Do you see that day coming?
I don't. I think that in light of the fact that Khan, the former or the now suspended president or prosecutor, chief prosecutor, there now is very strong evidence that the only reason he issued these indictments was to deflect attention from the credible sexual charges against him. I think that the ICC has lost its credibility on this. And my suspicion is that this will not come to a trial. But if it does, I'm ready and able to go to The Hague and defend Prime Minister Netanyahu. I will do it with pride and with hopefully with success if it comes to that. But I hope it won't come to that.
And of course, Netanyahu doesn't just have legal woes potentially at the ICC, he also has them domestically. And again, it's been reported that you've offered to give legal advice to Prime Minister Netanyahu on his domestic legal woes. Do you think, as some of Netanyahu's critics in Israel believe that he looks more vulnerable, he would look more vulnerable in a situation like the situation we're in now, that the war in Gaza is over? Do you subscribe to that?
I do not. I think that if he handles it well and takes responsibility for October 7th, the buck always stops at the very, very top, and moves forward and builds on some of these successes that he can endure politically. But, you know, his survival is not nearly as important as the survival of Israel as a vibrant democracy with equal rights for all of its citizens. That's the key, and I think that hope was strengthened today, and certainly President Trump made very strong statements today about Israel's permanence and endurance, and I would hope the protests against Israel would begin to dissipate, and effort should be made to help the Palestinian people rather than to hurt Israel.
We're talking to a few historians today and sort of taking a bit of a historical step back whilst looking at the last 24 months. I mean, how do you think this 24-month-long chapter is going to go down in history?
A tragedy, a totally avoidable tragedy. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. Hamas deliberately broke it. They broke it largely in order to prevent Israel from making peace with Saudi Arabia. They broke it in order to hurt Israel in the court of public opinion. To that respect, it succeeded. The fact that Britain and France and other countries have recognized the Palestinian state and given essentially the Palestinian people a reward for their support of Hamas is not a positive development. I think it will be seen as a tragedy that could easily have been avoided if Hamas had either not started the October 7th war, or if both sides had been more willing to come to the bargaining table with compromises earlier on in the process.
Well, you mentioned the UK and other European countries, but you've also warned in the past that Israel has lost support amongst the next generation of Americans. That's something you're quoted as saying. I mean, do you see that now being reversed now that the war is over?
No, I think it will be diminished to degree, but not reversed, because a lot of the opposition to Israel is unthinking opposition. It's just knee-jerk opposition. It's opposition to Western democracy. It's opposition to capitalism. It's opposition as strongly to the Gulf states as it is to Israel, because these radical protesters hate Qatar and hate Saudi Arabia and hate the Emirates as much as they do Israel. They've been focusing their attention on Israel, but their real focus is on free market economies, democracy, Western values, Judeo-Christian Islamic values. These are people who are enemies of peace and enemies of decency. And so I think that the protests will continue. They'll just be somewhat differently directed, but they will still be opposed to the United States and to the values reflected by the Abraham Accords. These are against the Abraham Accords.
Yeah, I mean, just lastly, I mean, obviously 67,000, although the number is disputed, I know, by Israel and others. 67,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza these last 24 months. I mean, that is perhaps what people who took to the streets, many of them would argue, brought them out onto the streets, was those daily pictures, gruesome pictures of emaciated children, maimed mothers. I think that's what people would say brought them out onto the streets as much as anything else. But would you say all of this, just to sort of wrap up this conversation, has damaged Israel's international standing?
Well, we have to remember that these protests began on October 8th, some of them on October 7th, before a single Israeli soldier went into Gaza, before there was any destruction of Gaza. So a lot of it was just aimed at Israel, and October 7th became an excuse, and so did the horrors that occurred in Gaza become an excuse. Let's remember, too, that many of the, not all, but many of the problems of Gaza came from the fact that Hamas conducted its war from behind civilians, using civilian structures, using schools, using mosques, using playgrounds. They built tunnels which they allowed only their fighters to use to protect themselves, making all their other non-fighters subject to Israelis' legitimate self-defense. So there's a lot of blame to be shared, and I don't think that the protests was solely directed against what happened in Gaza after the war began, although obviously some of it is a function of the terrible pictures that have been shown about destruction. But look, this was an important message to the world. Israel wanted to send a message that Jewish blood is no longer cheap, as it was during the Holocaust, as it was in many other instances, as it was on October 7th. And if you attack the state of Israel, if you attack the Jewish people, you will pay a heavy, perhaps disproportionate price. Some could argue it was disproportionate, but it was historically mandated by the fact that Jews have been subject to pogroms and Holocaust and genocide over so many years. And unfortunately, the price was paid by the citizens of Gaza, many of whom were innocent, some of whom were not, some of whom were complicit. It's a complicated story. I hope we can move on, and I hope we can rebuild Gaza the way the Americans rebuilt Germany after the Second World War and rebuilt Japan. Once total surrender occurs, then you can move toward the second phase of rebuilding, and I hope that will happen in Gaza.
Okay, well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Professor Alan Dershowitz, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much.